Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you. Uh-huh.
Do you understand?
What is it? Mute? I should do mute? Oh, good, it's recorded, then maybe you could listen to it later. Oh, that's the thing.
Hi, everyone. Just want to test out the audio and the video. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's noisy, but we hear you.
Hang tight. Oh, Thumbs up from Jenna Katz. We're gonna, we can hear you. And is the video choppy? Because we're using the Wi-Fi from inside. I want to know the signal strength is good.
It's
Is it a
so
good signal?
so.
Rabbi
It's
Belinsky,
okay.
can you hear me?
I hear you.
I think I'm gonna go to the hotspot. Hang tight.
Have fun storming the castle.
My name is
How's the quality now? Is it a little better?
It's okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I mean, that's part
We hear.
Jerry and Tamar, can you guys hear me? Rabbi Belinsky.
I hear you.
Gene,
We hear
Stephen.
you, but there's a lot of background.
Stephen, raise your hand if you can hear me okay.
It's okay if there's background noise. There are people there. We hear.
Rabbi Belinsky, it's decent. The quality's
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. The very narrow picture.
I can't, if you're speaking though, I can't hear you. It's too loud here.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you sign my forehead? That's correct. I would ask them. Just my forehead.
All right. Huh? Okay, friends, we can find seats. We're gonna grab a comfortable spot. Wonderful to see such a great crowd, both here and on Zoom. Welcome to everybody joining us on Zoom. Tonight we have the great scoot of celebrating a book, celebrating the launch, the publishing of a book, The Guide of the Perplexed, a Student's Companion, by our own Dr. Ben Katz. Introducing Ben for a number of talks and great Torah, and there's always so many angles you could introduce Dr. Katz on. There's the professional accomplishments. There's the scholastic accomplishments. There's the Menschlichkeit. There's the humility. There's the warmth, the congeniality. There's so many things to talk about Dr. Katz. This publishing this book is so inspiring to me. I have never written a book, and Dr. Katz has written already, how many? 2. And he's not actually a rabbi, but he's not a rabbi. So it's very humbling to know that a doctor who's in incredibly high demand especially over the last couple months, still has time to think and write really lishma in such a beautiful model for all of us, Torah lishma, what it means to love Torah and engage in Torah and make Torah accessible, yagdil Torah v'yadir, to make it great and beautiful and accessible to the world. Really just so many inspiring characteristics and traits. And of course, I cannot leave out just how grateful all of us are on behalf of all of us for all the tremendous work you have done over COVID to both keep our community safe, keep it functioning in terms of the life-saving nature of your work. No doubt that work has saved lives on both ends, on both keeping people protected and also keeping people connected, which is also so critical in life-saving. So we all are inspired by you. We're all grateful to you, and we're also happy to be here tonight celebrating the publishing of this work with you. So with that, I invite you forward, Dr. Katz. Come on up. Just leave that there.
I won't touch it.
Okay.
I'm a Luddite anyway. So thank you very much for that very warm introduction. I'm really honored that so many of you have come out this evening to hear about my little book. So without further ado, so Maimonides was born in Cordova, Spain in 1135. Now I'm gonna alternate between calling him Rambam and Maimonides, and both names actually mean the same thing. Maimonides means son of in Greek, and Rambam, as those of you who speak Hebrew know, it's an abbreviation for Rabbi Moses, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, the son of Maimon.
Ben.
So both names mean the same thing. So I'm just going to alternate at random. So
Ben, can you hear me?
Author of three great Jewish works, three classic Jewish works. The first one is his commentary on the Mishnah, and I'm going to give them in the order that he publishes them. So the first one is the commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah, of course, is the oral law that was compiled around the year 220 CE. His second great work, monumental work, is his Code of Jewish Law, the Mishnah Torah Yad HaChazakah. And the third one that we're going to spend most of the time discussing this evening for the next 15 minutes or so is the Guide of the Perplexed. But before we go into this in more detail, I just want to give you an idea what kind of life the Rambam led and how much he accomplished despite a fair amount of adversity. So he's born, like I said already, in Spain, probably around 1135. There's a little bit of scholarly debate as to what year he's actually born in. In 1148, the family has to leave Spain, probably due to persecution, and they wander around for about 10 years. Despite not having a permanent home, remember, we have homes and libraries and computers and available light. Despite not having a permanent home, Maimonides masters medieval astronomy, writes a book about the calendar, which is not easy to do, and he starts working on his Mishnah commentary. In 1160, the family settles in Morocco, but then due to persecution have to leave again. They eventually wind up settling in Fastat, which is Old Cairo in Egypt in 1166. We have someone who was born near there in the audience. In 1168, he publishes his commentary on the Mishnah, and he's all of 33 years old. Remember, to do that, you have to go through all of the Talmud, of course. So he publishes that when he's 33. So, okay. And from 1173 to 1174, he takes up the practice of medicine. So I guess medical school was a little shorter back then because it wasn't as much to learn. He also got a great internship. He becomes appointed one of the caliph's personal physicians. So he gets a great internship right out of medical school. I'm not sure how he did it exactly. In 1180, he publishes the Mishnah Torah. He's all of 45 years old. In this great work, the only one of his written in Hebrew, interestingly enough, everything else he writes in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic with Hebrew letters. He codifies all of Jewish law. This is something that was never done before and never done after. So even laws of sacrifices that were inoperative since the time of the Second Temple being destroyed over 1,000 years before he was born, he codifies every law. And again, no one else has ever done that. In 1195, a young Jewish scholar called Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Simon, so I'll call him Joseph, not that I know him really, but just for simplicity, he seeks out the Rambam as a mentor, and he becomes Rambam's favorite pupil. But unfortunately, he can't keep studying with him forever. So the Rambam basically writes this book, The Guide of the Perplexed, for his favorite student, through this guy Joseph. So the book is published 5 years later in 1190. The Rambam is 55 years old now. It's his last great Jewish work. Rambam dedicates the book to his pupil, Joseph, like I mentioned. And because Maimonides is essentially writing for his most brilliant favorite student, whom he studied with, he purposely he writes in a cryptic style. And he says he's doing this, he acknowledges this in his introduction. So it's not the easiest book to read. Also, the Rambam is trying to hide his more radical philosophical ideas from the hoi polloi, if you will, from the masses. So he says in his introduction, I'm going to make the book a little tricky. I'm going to put in some contradictions, so you can't really tell what I really think. That's what he says. You can't make this up. So anyway, because of that, the book has been a little bit hard to read over the years, and it's inside a lot of commentaries you might expect. So the guide is divided into 3 books, or into 3 sections. In book 1, Maimonides basically spends most of the book trying to convince people that God doesn't have a body. In book 2, he starts off by proving God's existence, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. And then he tackles the big topics of creation and prophecy. In the 3rd book, he deals mainly with the topics of divine providence, hashgacha pratit, and the purpose of the commandments, ta'amei hamitzvot. The guide is translated into many languages, and all over Europe and the Middle East it's circulated, and Jews and non-Jews alike are affected by this book. Some of the famous Catholic and Christian theologians who read the book, and they knew Rambam by his kind of like funny name. They called him Maimon Idaicus. Maimon the Jew is how he was referred to in the Middle Ages by non-Jews. And so Thomas Aquinas, for example, is very influenced by his book. And what the Rambam is trying to do in this book, we'll talk a little bit more about this as the talk goes on for the next few minutes. He's trying to unite the God of the Bible, who intervenes in history, with the God of the philosophers, who generally does not, kind of like sets the world up and kind of pushes it and lets it go. For the rest of his life, from about 1190 to 1204, Maimonides mainly practices medicine. And he writes in his letters how busy he is. He barely has time to pray, he says, except on Shabbat. That's what he says. Let me paraphrase what a professor of philosophy in California has to say about the Rambam. We find in him a scholar who had the intelligence and memory and had invested the time and energy needed for mastering the vast sea of classic rabbinic literature by the age of 23, who had managed to study medicine during the same period, who had acquired a knowledge of philosophy, and who possessed an impressive level of expertise in the intricacies of medieval astronomy. He was not an ordinary man. This is not me. And he was a phenomenon. Okay, so all that being said, there were many other great medieval Jewish thinkers, and there were many other great medieval non-Jewish great thinkers. So why is the Rambam called Hanesher Hagadol, the great eagle? And why is it so important to study a book written in an obscure style in the 12th century today in the 21st century? And that's what I'm going to try to answer for you in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so that I'm going to be chatting here. And that's why I wrote my little book, which is kind of like a Monarch Notes or a Cliff Notes to the Guide of the Perplexed. It even has a nice yellow cover, just like Cliff Notes used to have. Okay, so first of all, I already mentioned that Maimonides' book is rooted in Greek philosophy and the Greek philosophical tradition. In the early Middle Ages, Greek works of philosophy were being translated into European, well, they were first translated into Arabic by the Neoplatonists, and then they were starting to be translated from Arabic into Christian languages. So people started to realize that there were these pagans who came to an idea of God without revelation. Think about that. This is an astounding thing, right? Here we are. We have these wonderful works. You know, if you're Christian, you have the Bible. If you're Jewish, you have the Bible. If you're Muslim, you know, you have the Quran, and you have this revealed word of God. But these guys were pagans and basically thought of the same thing. So intellectuals from all the 3 great monotheistic religions had to somehow cope with this new modern stuff that was being available. And if they want, and these were the intellectual advanced thinking of the time. And if you wanted to maintain some kind of a traditional religious outlook, you somehow had to have some way of incorporating this new thinking into your religious traditional beliefs. Sound familiar? That's what we're all trying to do today, 8 centuries later, right? We have geology and archaeology and biology and all these things that we're trying to make sense with Torah. So it's the exact same thing, just 8 centuries before. And he really gives, I think, thinking Jews an approach to modernity, even though our modernity is not the same as his modernity was. Now, remember again, Greek philosophy was the science of its day. And whether or not we agree with how Maimonides synthesized it too, or even if we even give a hoot about Greek philosophy, it's the approach, which is super important, which I'm going to be speaking about, like I said, I keep saying in the next couple of minutes. So, for example, the Rambam believed that the Torah was true and that Greek philosophy is true. So if 2 things are true, they have to be compatible with each other. So, for example, the Rambam would make fun of people, I think, who somehow don't believe in evolution because it kind of contradicts the Torah. Can't contradict the Torah. The Torah is true and evolution is true. You have to figure out some way that the 2 are compatible. And I'm not going to get into how we do that or how he did that necessarily. The way the Rambam did it actually was to do a lot of figurative interpretation, non-literal interpretation. He wasn't the first person to do that, but he did it in a very radical way. In fact, it's funny. He had so many allegorical interpretations that the Rashba in 1305 wrote a tshuva to outlaw allegorical interpretation of the Chumash. It's kind of funny, really. I mean, it took such a hold, and people think actually that the Rambam publishing his work forced Kabbalah, if you will, out of the corners and made people publish the Zohar. It's kind of interesting to think about it, but whatever. So I'll give you another few examples of the Rambam's approach. So, for example, the Rambam didn't believe that a donkey could talk. This is not rocket science, right? So he said that the story of the talking donkey and the story of Bilam and the Chumash is a vision. That's what he says. He also says that every time an angel speaks to a human being, it's a vision. Now, this is a tremendously radical comment, and he doesn't give you all of its implications in the guide, but this has implications for many narratives throughout the Bible, not the least of which is the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. In fact, one of my old friends in New York just called me this morning. She's teaching a Bible course in New York, and she's up to the Akedah, and she wanted to know, she wanted to discuss 1 or 2 things with me, and this kind of approach is very interesting to the Akedah. We're not going to get into it now, but let me just say that for the Rambam, as he calls them, the gates of figurative interpretation are never closed. So he, for example, if he thinks something is true, he's not in other words, just because a literal interpretation of the Bible might lead you a different way, he's not necessarily going to follow that interpretation, which is, I think, a very bold move to make. He's not the first to do it, but again, he's a very, very big proponent of this. So much so, like I said, that there were people who tried to push back. The second is that the Rambam was one of the first people to approach the Bible in its historical context. And again, he's not the first to do this, he's not the only one to do this, but he was very radical in doing this. Probably his most radical example, which many of you may know, which a lot of you may know, is that he says that sacrifices have no intrinsic religious value, none. And in fact, I'm not sure if he was a funny guy or not, but there's one part of the book that at least strikes me as being funny. He says, if you look for reasons for the number of animals or the types of animals for the sacrifices, you're crazy. He says, you're struck with a kind of madness. He says, there's no reason that one sacrifices 3 turtle doves, another one is 2 goats. God had to pick some numbers. And he had to pick some animals. Doesn't matter what they were. They have no interest. That's what, I mean, again, you can't make this up. This is in the book. He says this. Now, so why did God do this? Well, God did this, according to the Rambam, because Israelites in those days had no other way of worshiping a deity aside from sacrificing. He actually says in the guide, it would be like today, somebody coming and say, you don't have to pray or fast. Just meditate about God all day. Which is also an interesting idea because to him, I'm not even sure that praying and fasting was the be-all and end-all of religious experience. But that being said, he says sacrifices have no intrinsic religious value. They were just instituted for the time. And so in that way, almost, you think about the Torah as almost like a programmed text. It's not just a book to teach you how to live. It's to try to get you to live and to think better, almost, to try to move you on to another stage, if you will. Now, while he's doing this, of course, the Rambam believes that it was still important to inculcate into people proper beliefs and proper opinions about God. So, for example, in the context of the sacrifice, they all had to be devoted, of course, straight to God. Also, and to nobody else. Also, he was a big, he doesn't like, not that he doesn't like, you're not allowed to pray to intermediaries, according to the Rambam. So you can't pray to angels, can't pray to rabbis, you have to pray just to God. I'm just telling you, that's just telling you. The other thing about it is that, so for example, pagans thought that gods actually ate the sacrifices. If you look at the story of Noah that's in the Gilgamesh epic, the gods, after Gilgamesh is in the ark, after Napishtim is in the ark for all that time, the gods are starving because there's nobody to eat, to serve or anything. So when he comes out and he makes an altar, they're buzzing around the altar. They're waiting. They're like waiting to eat. So that's not a proper monotheistic idea. So according to the Rambam, the reason why you're not allowed to have honey on the altar, the reason why there's no leaven on the altar, and the reason why all the sacrifices are salted is to show that they don't really taste good. That we're just doing it to somehow get closer to God, but we're not doing it to feed God. So again, even though God tolerated sacrifices, if you will, he was still trying to teach the Israelites at the time important lessons about a proper thought. Now, this idea about understanding the Bible in its ancient context, I think, is also very important today, the same way that we would approach, for example, modern biblical scholarship. And again, I talked a little bit about that in my first book, but the point is that, you have to understand that the Bible was written to be understood 3,300 years ago, as well as to be timeless. And that's a very important way to look at the text, and it helps explain a lot, I believe. Okay. Third, the Rambam respected Greek philosophy, as I've said many times, and he mastered medicine and astronomy. And this shows the importance of secular knowledge to him. I mean, again, the Rambam, it's inconceivable to me that if he were alive today, he wouldn't be in some university studying the best science, the best mathematics, the best astronomy, because that's what he did in his own time. So to think again, like some people on the right, that the only thing to do is to study Torah, I mean, he would make fun of those kinds of ideas, because you have to have a wide secular knowledge in order to be able to understand the world around you and to appreciate it. Fourth, the Rambam was a big rationalist. I already mentioned the fact that he allegorized Bilam's talking donkey. He also tried to tone down a lot of miracles, if you will. In other words, to him, the miraculous thing might have been the timing. He argued very strongly against any kind of change in nature that would occur during a miracle. He also championed citing truth, no matter who says it, even if it's a pagan. Remember, Aristotle was essentially a pagan. He wasn't exactly a pagan. He kind of rejected idols, but he certainly wasn't a Jew, and he certainly wasn't a prophet, right? So he cites Aristotle, Plato, Muslim philosophers all the time, and he calls Aristotle ha-philosoph, the philosopher. So he had incredible respect for knowledge wherever it came from, and he was a big rationalist. Just as an aside, he was the only medieval authority that I'm aware of who completely rejected astrology. He said, he almost rejects spontaneous generation. Everybody till relatively modern times believed that, bugs came from dirt, and even mice can come out of dirt. There are actually halachic ramifications to that idea in the Talmud, believe it or not. But he says, it's such a great, the only reason I believe it, the Rambam says, is because so many reliable people told me that it was so. That's what he says. But he even has doubts about that. He also didn't believe, for example, that the entire universe was created just for man. He was not anthrocentric. A line from the guy, it says something like, "The stars do not exist for our sake, but to rule over the night." So there's other reasons for creating things besides just for man. So the Rambam has at least two purposes in writing the guide. One is to prove God didn't have a body, and the second was to remove superstition from Judaism and to provide Judaism with a firm philosophical basis. Now, the first objective is not a big deal for us today, but it's really, like I said already, the topic of book one of the guide. Now, again, to us, it's not a big deal. And book one is the easiest book to read of the Guide of the Perplexed, because we're used to the fact that the Bible speaks in, non-literal terms. And when it talks about God's mouth, God's nose, God's outstretched arm, these are all expressions, right? But in the Rambam's day, that wasn't so simple. And he had a lot of pushback from the Ravid and from other great Rishonim. The Rambam basically says, if you think God has a body, you don't have a share of the world to come. And the Ravid says in Hilchot Tshuvos, and he says, bigger people than you thought that God had a body. That's what he says. But anyway, he had pushback, but he was very firm in this. Now, to remove superstition from Judaism, the Rambam's approach was a little bit more subtle. And it begins in his great law code. So, for example, if the Talmud quotes something that he thinks is superstitious, he either doesn't quote it or changes the reason. And there's dozens of examples of this. Just to give you a few, the reason that the Shulchan Aruch, and even though the Rambam tried to do this later, Shulchan Aruch still have superstition in them, unfortunately. So, for example, if you look up in Karel's Shulchan Aruch, the reason you say Kriyat Shema before you go to bed is to prevent demons from attacking you at night. Again, it's in there. Just what it says. The Rambam doesn't believe any of that. The Rambam doesn't believe you should consult demons. The Rambam doesn't believe in an evil eye. So there's a lot of these things that he, that he rejects, or that he changes the reason up to make them more rational. So he's also, like I said at the beginning of book 2, he tries to give the God. He starts out by proving that God exists, and he does that also in his law code. And again, it makes sense, right? Why should I keep all these laws if I don't even believe in God, right? So he proves God exists, and then he comes in with the rest of his with all of his legal arguments. And then from there, he goes on to discuss creation and prophecy. And in book 3, he then goes on to discuss again Hashgacha Pratit and the reason for the miracles. Now, in his discussion of creation in book 2, he wrestles with the 2 prevailing philosophical opinions at the time. Did God create the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, or was there some pre-existent eternal matter that God used to fashion the whole world? Now, you'd think from the first pasuk in the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashmayim v'ha'aretz, it kind of sounds like creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. One translation is God created in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So there was nothing, and he created heaven and earth. But it's not really so straightforward. And first of all, the Rambam was willing to figuratively reinterpret that verse if necessary. And if you think about it, it's really not quite that straightforward, because Mayim, water is never created. And neither is wind or air, right? The Spirit of God floats on the water. So wind and air and water are somehow seen to be, if you will, pre-existent matter. And those are 2 of the 4 Greek elements, right? So there is stuff to work with here. So the point that, without giving too much away, the Rambam, again, you'll see this in the book in more detail, but the Rambam at least hints at a non-traditional approach to creation, which he thinks is the best way to understand it. That's in book 2. In his discussion of the purpose of the mitzvot in book 3, what the Rambam there is saying is that if God is a supreme intellect, God is never gonna make you do something which is silly or has no purpose. Okay, so now what about the classical distinction about chok and mishpat, right? According to the rabbis, there are mishpatim, laws that have an obvious purpose, like don't murder, don't steal, don't kill. And then there are laws that don't have a purpose, perhaps like kashrut. According to the Rambam, he does this all the time. He gives a brilliant little tweak to that notion. He says, a chok is not a law that has no purpose, and it's a law that has no obvious purpose, no easily discernible purpose. And what he's gonna, so for example, and again, whether you agree or disagree, it's the approach. He thinks kashrut laws are there for health reasons, for example. He says the only law he can't find a reason for is paraduma, the red heifer, which is kind of interesting. But every other law he tries to explain. It's either to wean people from idolatry, or to build better society, or to improve your character. So he always finds some reason to do it. And again, whether you agree or disagree, it's the rationalistic approach that I find appealing. So just on a personal note, I really couldn't take religion seriously without this kind of an approach that the Rambam brings to you. And after studying the guide for many years, and after thinking I kind of get it, I decided to write a little companion book to help an ambitious reader get through the guide. I explained the philosophical concepts that the Rambam assumed all his educated readers would know. So for example, today you write a book, you don't have to explain electricity, gravity, everybody kind of knows electricity and gravity is, even if we're not all physicists, right? So there were concepts that he talks about that every educated person in his day knew that we don't know today. It's especially at the end of book 1, there's a lot of philosophy there. And I try to explain it so that you can kind of read it and see what he's talking about. I also provide a chapter-by-chapter summary, as well as an overview of his life and works, a bibliography, and an index. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll just say one other thing. And again, I have to thank some of my friends for this discussion about this. I know this book, somehow it's being undersold on Amazon. I'm not sure exactly why. I don't even get it for less than half the cover price. So I don't understand how, it's a lawsuit. They're trying to drive booksellers out of business. If you bought it on Amazon, it's fine. I'm happy to sign it. But here, we're going to sell them for $15, and we're going to, and a portion of each one will go to the shul. Okay. So thank you for your attention. And questions, otherwise,
I have a question.
yes, please.
Okay. We have this
philosophy, yesh me yesh, that we learned from the Shunami Mayesh Lapabayas. So Bria Sa'olam is the only time we have something from nothing. Everything else is something. So now you're saying that Rambam is saying that Bria Sa'olam is not something from nothing?
Okay, so let me just say, so the standard Jewish interpretation is yesh me'ayin, and not, ex nihilo is something from nothing, and it's very complicated. I didn't want to. Like I said, a 15-minute overview wouldn't do it justice, but the Rambam certainly takes very seriously the possibility that the earth was created out of pre-existent matter. He quotes Plato and Aristotle, who both believe that. And again, without getting into the details, let me just give you one other thing. The Rambam, for example, never uses the verb create. He says God caused it to come into being. So he's hedging his bets, even in his discussion. A superficial reading of the guide will probably convince you that he believes in creation from nothing, but I'm not so sure that's correct. And if you read the book, and not only just me, but other people think this too. But I explained it in the book. He gives enough hints in the book that it's likely that he did not believe that God created something from that God. Because let me just say one other thing. God can't do everything. God can't make 2 and 2 equal 5 in the universe the way he created it. So that God can't do things that are logically impossible. So like, when you're in 7th grade and some budding atheist asks you, well, if God is so great, can you make a rock too heavy for him to lift? That's a question that makes no sense, because there is no such thing as something that's too heavy for God to lift. So God, of course, can't create something that doesn't exist. So if creation from nothing is impossible in the physical world, the way even God couldn't do it. So it's an interest. So again, like I said, God can't make 2 and 2 equals 5 in the world the way he created it. So, and God, for whatever reason, decides to follow the rules of the universe as he created it. So let me just say, again, without giving it away, I don't want to say it too glibly, but if you read the book and if you read some of the articles that I refer to in the book, it's very possible that the Rambam believed in creation of that God used some kind of eternal matter to create the universe. And for sure, Gersonides says this. Ralbag, who was one of the Rambam's intellectual descendants, in his Torah commentary says it, that God created the world out of pre-existent matter. And it's like, but it's funny, it's matter that's so thin, it doesn't really have any substance, but he definitely says it in his commentary. And so does Ibn Kaspi, another medieval philosopher. Huh? Well, or in other words, that there's matter that was coexistent with, it's hard to say what happened before God, right? You can't say what happened before the Big Bang, right? So in other words, that there was matter that was existed alongside God, and that God used that matter to create the universe. That's probably the best way to try to explain it.
God didn't create the universe.
Well, that's the assumption.
He talked about that in the Torah, 4 different forms.
Correct. He doesn't, right. So Rambam was wrestling with these ideas his whole adult life. There's a lot of philosophy in the Mishnah Torah, but he really comes to grips with it in the guide. And in fact, there are some places where the guide contradicts his code of Jewish law. And I talk about that in the book a little bit too, and so do people a lot smarter than me. And what they say is that either he changed his mind, or in his more philosophical work, like for example, in the code of Jewish law, this Mishnah Torah, he says you're not supposed to say that Shiluach Hakan, sending away the mother bird before you take the eggs, is because of mercy. But that's exactly what he says in the guide when he explains the reason for it. So again, so he was wrestling with these ideas his whole life, and you're right. There's some of it in the Mishnah Torah also, but it really comes out in the guide. Yeah, please, Dennis.
For an amateur like me, what are 2 things that you take away how to look at him when reading? Because I'm very confused.
Well, that's why the book is here to help you. I think, the thing, so, there's things I talk about, the rationalistic approach, the fact that the Bible has a historical context to it, the fact that things can be interpreted figuratively, and it doesn't make you an apikoides, as some people would think. Those 3 or 4 principles that I talked about are the things I think the Ram takes away. Yeah, please.
What was his proof that God exists?
All right. It's funny. I can't give you everything in a 15. It's basically, it's a motion argument, right? So it's like it's the prime. He takes it from Aristotle. It's the prime mover argument. What he says is, look, everything in the heavens is in motion. Something has to set it in motion. Who set it in motion? God. I mean, that's very trivial. That's kind of the approach that he uses to prove that God exists. Again, whether you like it or you don't like it, the point is he felt compelled to do it. Cairo doesn't start his Shulchan Aruch proving that God exists, right? Only the Rambam starts his Shulchan Aruch proving that God exists. And again, I'm not so anti-Cairo, but there is superstition in the Shulchan Aruch, and there's none in the Mishnah Torah. That's all I can say. Yes, please.
Yeah, you say that Moshe will come to Moshe.
Right.
But if he is so radical and so scientific, has he through the generations from 1135 to 1204 been accepted by all?
Also, okay, so that's another, I could talk about, I could talk about this for hours. I'm happy to stay here. So, you probably know that there were for example, so the Rambam is a relatively young man, publishing in those days wasn't like it is today, right? So this book should have come out a year ago because of COVID. It got a little delayed, whatever. Huh? He didn't gather his friends. Actually, he might have, but that he probably did, just like Avram Avinu. But so basically, he finishes this manuscript and he gives it to copyists to copy, and it slowly gets disseminated. So I mentioned the Ravid already, or David of Poitiers. He was a much older. He sees this massive book written by this whippersnapper, basically, that he never heard of before, because he lives 500 miles away in Cairo, and this guy he's in France, and then he sees all these crazy ideas. He's telling me that I have to believe that God exists, and I'm not getting through with God. He wrote critical. He was very critical of the Rambam, and of course, during his lifetime, you couldn't get away with criticizing him too much because he was just. He was just the smartest person. I think he's the smartest Jew who ever lived. To tell you the truth, I think he's the smartest person. One of the smartest people who ever lived. So but after he died, his stuff started to become criticized. There were famous Maimonidean controversies where they burned his books, but clearly that never went out. And so in the yeshiva world, people don't study the guide that much. I have to admit, although Rabbi Soloveitchik, gave a course on the guide in the 50s or the 60s at REITs at YU. Someone published his lecture notes. I reviewed that book. It's not the greatest example explaining it, but the point is people took it seriously who were philosophically bent. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Some yeshivas, they won't let you read it.
Right, and some people read it. Some people say you have to be 40 to read it. You're right. But to me, if the silly thing about not reading the guide, in my opinion, is that all this stuff is in his Mishnah Torah too. It's not all of it. A lot of it is there too, but it's just the beginnings of it. So you can't, and everybody uses everyone uses this Mishnah Torah. Oh, that was criticized too. The title itself is very haughty. Mishnah Torah is second to the Torah. Also, Yad HaChazekah is a reference to the last verse in the Bible that talks about Moshe's dying. He's kind of comparing himself to Moshe a little bit. And he writes in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, all you have to do is read the Chumash, read my book, everything to do, now study philosophy. That's basically what he says. So it's a little bit haughty. So he was a little controversial, but nobody, again, when people say, oh, only the Rambam is the only one who says this. Yeah, but it's like saying, well, Einstein's the only one who says this. He might be as they call it, das yachad, a single opinion, but it's a pretty big opinion. And you have people to rely on if you follow Maimonides. You tell a Haredi that the Rambam paskins that if you don't work for a living, you have no share in the they'll tell you, okay. So other people disagree. But he says that if you take money for Jewish, and again, he not to say anything about current day rabbis, who work very hard. I'm talking about people who sit and learn all day and who think they should be supported by their father. Well, father-in-law is okay, but by their community. The Rambam says that if you don't earn a living, you have if you take public charity to learn, you have no share in the world to come. You can't be clearer about this. People don't like it, but they still study the Mishnah Torah. Michael.
Ramban, in essence, knowing asserts that anyone who believes that matter is eternal is so evil that they don't deserve any reward in this world or the next, no matter if they were a perfectly nice person. Was Ramban responding to Rambam, would you think?
Oh, so the Ramban was clearly the Rambam's biggest sustained intellectual critic. The Ravid kind of takes pot shots at the Rambam. Oh, I don't like this halacha. I'll write a little nasty note on the side and I'll publish it in the. That's really what it is. He writes little nasty notes on the side of the Mishnah Torah. The Ramban makes a full throttled attempt. That being said, he was never for. It was in his lifetime. Ramban is younger than the Rambam. He's about 1,500 years later. The Ramban never thought that you should burn his books. Never. He defended the Rambam, even though he violently disagreed with him. So, but you're right. Now again, the Rambam doesn't clearly say that he believes that God created his eternal mind. You have to read you read the guide, read my book, and see if I can convince you, and other people convince you that that's what he thinks. But he certainly takes it as a reasonable possibility. And the Rambam certainly wouldn't say that anyone who believes that has no share in the world. That's what, because he's giving it a respectable airing, even if he says at the end of the day that's not what you're supposed to believe. Although I think he really does. But you have to read the book to find out why. Has to be some kind of non-spoiler alert here.
Didn't the Rambam believe that constellations had some sort of intellect?
Yeah. So again, these are all. So if you think about it, so ancient man looks up at the sky and they see things that are moving, right? He thought, not just him, everybody in those days thought that anything that moving had to have some kind of an intelligence to it. They didn't know about gravity, obviously, and so they thought that anything that's moving has some kind of intelligence. And he thought that the stars were angels, essentially. So when the Gemaras, when the Chumash or the Tanakh was about a malach, an angel, he thought he meant the heavens. And he has a whole cosmology. Again, remember, he didn't know that the sun. He thought that the sun revolved around it. He thought a lot of things that were wrong, and that's okay. But again, it's the approach. But you're absolutely right. He thought that they also thought that there were different laws of physics in space than there are on Earth. Right? That's where the word quintessence comes from, right? They thought there were 4 elements, and the quintessence, the 5th element, was the one that happened in space. That's why quintessence means the best. So they thought that there was different elements up there. They thought, for example, that on Earth, if you put something in motion, it eventually stops, right? Because of friction or whatever. But in space, they thought that things just spun forever. So there were different laws of physics in space, and they thought about angels as being. So again, the whole physics is wrong, but again, the approach I think is fascinating. And again, I talk about it. You can't really read the guy without understanding 12th century astronomy. So I talk about that a little bit in the book too. Everything I talk about a little bit.
Ben.
All right. If there's no other, I'm happy to answer more questions for everyone.
Ben.
And again, if you want to buy a book, I'm happy to buy it. If you bought it already for $5 at Amazon, I'm happy for $4. I'm happy to sign it. Thank you.
Ben?
Dr. Katz,
Yes, sir.
she said she paid for it.
Thanks,
My
everybody.
wife. That's fine.
Okay, I guess I won't
Oh,
ask,
A chatima.
but it's already done.
You decide, you're the author.
It's a little easier for me in English.
Skokie Valley.
Thanks,